Ever since I saw James Cameron's Avatar, it has been a dream of mine to create a miniature version of that world. A build that not only had a flowing river system, but also had legendary floating mountains, a fog system, and get this, I managed to find rocks and even plants that glow. So the dream of recreating the world of Avatar has just come true. In the next 15 minutes or so, I'm going to walk you through this legendary build step by step so that you can make your very own alien world. Welcome to the Microverse. For this glorious build, I'm using the Exoterra Paludarium 12x12x24. So, here is the plan. I want the viewing angle to be the left side glass panel. This will give us an unobstructed view of the entire build. So after some planning of the overall layout, I started this build with the floating mountains. To keep them light enough to attach to the glass, I used expanding foam to create the globules that will then be carved into mighty mountains. I used this hydroponic planter to create a cavity so that I can plant this majestic mountain of ours. While the foam cures, I add a frosted film to the background and the right side of the paludarium. I found this to be the best to keep some empty space if you want to give the illusion of continuation. It's also nice if you want to play around with background lighting in the future. After 24 hours, the foam cured and we can start carving the floating mountains. After the long, messy, yet oddly satisfying process of carving the foam, I used gel superglue to add some dragonstone bits. This helps give the illusion of rocks embedded in dirt. I then used the silicone and cocoa fiber method to naturalize the foam mountains. Always use bone-dry cocoa fiber, as any humidity in the materials will cause the silicone to cure prematurely and not adhere properly to whatever materials you are using. At this point, I wasn't sure if I wanted to do a river thing like the nation of Amphibia. Sometimes you gotta figure things out as you go. But I knew I wanted to do something, and I needed a sump area anyway between the aquatic portion of the build and the terrestrial portion of the build. So I played around with corrugated plastic until I came to a formation that I found suitable. I then made holes in the structure and used silicone to adhere a mesh barrier. This will serve as our mechanical filtration later on. I then siliconed some dragonstone on the corrugated plastic to give a sense of continuity and tie the scape together. I use hot glue to keep the structure in place while I apply the silicone. I created and siliconed an extra sump area just for the pump to sit in. This is when the first challenge presented itself. The pump scored. There is no long corner sump to hide it, nor a foam background in which to tuck it. I had to trust the process. So, I proceeded with the piece of corrugated plastic as the base for my river. After I make sure it fits in the sump area, I put cling wrap around the corner to make the river removable. I do this in order to access the pump, which is crucial for long-term maintenance. While the main area of the foam cures, I proceed to foam the floating mountains in place. In hindsight, this was a huge mistake, but we'll get to that. The next day, I carved the river a out of the cliff structure, making sure to cut strategically so it fits together like I then start carving out the river system as I want a sense of continuity. This means making sure the aesthetics are consistent and adding all the same elements throughout the entire build. How you carve the foam will even play a role in getting a sense of continuity. After doing a fit test, I added some foam to the lip of the river that spills into the aquatic portion, and do the same with the terrestrial area. I place the river structure back before making some modifications. I do this in order to gain a better idea of how the structure flows together. This is when I add some detailing. I superglued this driftwood to conceal a gap, and do one last fit test before getting the silicone involved. I wanted to add an even smaller floating mountain closer to the river, so I started naturalizing that one. It is very important while using this method to press materials into the silicone, and that these materials are absolutely bone dry for optimal adhesion. I add a bit of fine aquarium gravel to the riverbed, as well as some dragonstone detailing to the edges of the structure. But I still had a huge problem to deal with. The pump scored. It would instantly take away from the scape if there was a black cord clearly going somewhere. And then it hit me. Why not hide the cord in plain sight? So I'll just silicone some cocoa fiber on it and make it into a vine. Maybe even grow some moss on it.
Nobody's gonna know. They're gonna know. How would they know?
Ooh, by the way, my terrarium supervisor says that 90% of viewers aren't even subscribed, so if you want to help me keep my job, please consider subscribing to the channel. This will do us a big motivate, and get this guy to stop hounding me.
That would be great. Okay.
It was then time to silicone the riverbed, cliffs, and barrier structure in the tank. The next day, it was time for the components to assemble. Components, assemble! The river fit perfectly, and I had decided to balance the smaller floating mountain on the piece of spiderwood, giving the illusion that the roots sprouted from the mountain to the land. I superglued it in place before doing a water test. And since we are doing a water test, I might as well do a fog test to see how things flow. This is where the Exoterra humidifier comes in. And since they also sent me the extension kit, I'm going to set this humidifier up for the Greater Guild of Gaconia as well as the Floating Forest, known henceforth as the Nation of Crustacea. If you want to pick up one of these bad boys, I'll put a link in the description below. After a considerable amount of wiggling the tech this time, I came to an arrangement that was suitable. Both the river and the fog were flowing nicely, so I start adding the roots. These floating mountains are attached to each other by vines and roots of the local flora. After another water test, I added some more driftwood to certain areas of the river structure for a better flow. I created a smaller vine using some twine, silicone, and cocoa fiber, adding the big-small contrast, and helping to sell the idea that the cord is just actually a vine. For optimal biological filtration of the water, I am using the Exoterra Biodrain, which is essentially small lava rock. After rinsing and rehydrating the lava rock, I completely fill the area underneath the river, as no plants will be planted above this area, and add a generous layer throughout, making sure to keep lava rock covering the mesh barrier. This will greatly help in letting water pass through for optimal water circulation. For substrate, I am using the Exoterra substrata, a rich volcanic soil that is both porous and nutritious, and is absolutely perfect for perma-wet environments such as this one. After filling the land area and some of the floating mountains, it is time for planting. But before we start planting, let's discuss lighting. For light, I am using the new Exoterra Canopy Top, as well as the TerraSky UV LED light, which has a UV reactive function that might come in handy later on. I start planting with one of my most beloved ferns in the world, the Japanese asparagus fern. This one will go in the small land area at the leftmost of the build. As it grows, it will frame the paludarium nicely. The main plant I have chosen to be the centerpiece of this build is the Anglonema pictum tricolor, one of my absolute favorite plants. This is a baby, but here is what the grown leaves look like. Nothing really beats the variety and color that the foliage of this plant exhibits. I then add this Peruvian fern with the name I'm not even going to try, but here it is on the screen now. Good luck with that. I then add little rhizomes of zebra fern around the river, before adding another of the asparagus ferns to the mouth of the river. I have seen people growing these delicate-looking flora in an aquatic setting, so it's a bit of an experiment. I added a little bit of moss and liverwort before laying the base for our aquatic section. For the aquatic section substrate, I use a mix of gravel, fine gravel, and sand. I add the bigger gravel to where the mesh barriers are, followed by the finer gravel, and then finally the sand, to keep a good water circulation going. I fill it up with water and make sure everything is flowing smoothly, both the river and the fog. Gotta love that fog. Next day, I started to add the magic paste of moss in anticipation of adding sweet mossomeness to this already majestic build. Then I noticed the big mountain move. Yep. At this point, I had spent about 5 days putting this masterpiece together, and then this happens. But as Bob Ross once said, if you are learning, you are not failing. After collecting myself, I realized my mistake, so here is what we learned. I used spray foam to attach the mountains to the glass. I found that spray foam is more effective at holding on to the glass when the whole background is covered in it. But when it comes to adhering smaller items, it is actually best to use silicone. So, I excessively applied silicone and mushed the mountain back in place and propped it up with some wood, and prayed to the mosses for it to work. And the mosses did not disappoint. The mosses never disappoint. And after reassembling the roots between the mountains, I could finally add the magic paste of moss. You know what time it is? Recently, I have been putting all the moss varieties I have into my builds. So, I fetched some mystery moss from the nation of Amphibia, some tangled thread moss from the haunted Hex Terrarium, as well as these mosses from my moss farm. Pincushion moss, live sphagnum moss, fern moss, thread moss, and Riccia moss was added to the river area, like I have going on in Amphibia. Now that the floating mountains and land area is all planted, let's address the aquatic portion of the build. The main plant for the aquatic portion will be the Anubias nana pinto, a small leafed epiphyte with white variegations on the leaves. I wedge a couple near the main hardscape, and one in this section towards the front. For mid-ground, I'll be using chainswords. Chainswords! They kinda look like dwarf sage, and I do have trouble seeing the difference sometimes. I also wanted a carpeting plant of sorts. These are baby tears. A very unfortunate name, I know. But these are baby tears. Baby tears are, to me, a stem plant, but it is also small that it is often used for carpeting scapes. It does take an incredible amount of trimming and maintenance long term if you wanted to carpet any aquascape. These floating mountains will absolutely dry out if left as is. Luckily, we have the Exoterra humidifier. I did have to get a bit creative with the extension kit to get the fog to disperse exactly how I wanted it to. Due to the fog, the spiderwood had started to mold, so custodians were in order. For cleanup crew, of the terrestrial area at least, I will be adding two very colorful types of springtails, orange and yellow springtails. But which species will win the Battle of Tail Springs? For cleanup crew in the aquatic section, I will be adding these awesome orange shrimp. However, the color in hindsight was a huge mistake, because the sand is also orange, so they are a little bit hard to see. I should have went with the crystal reds to provide some contrast. I let the build establish for some time, and made minor tweaks here and there. I also managed to get some crystal red shrimp. And I created and added a fifth mountain to the edge of the river, and attached it with spiderwood and superglue. A little bit of moss was added to conceal the superglue, and because of moss. I also added this reddish variety of Peacock Slaginella. Light temperature can have a very interesting effect on this plant. Its red phase also reacts to UV. I also acquired some Yoperlite rock that also reacts to UV. May the moss be with you.